Hello, my name is Joan Hopkins and I'm a counsellor for Fingal. So I'd like to welcome you to our final session of this year's summer school entitled Inequality, the Greatest Challenge to Democracy. I'm sure you will agree that it's been a fascinating couple of days with great speakers who have been reminding us why politics matter and how we can all make a difference. This is our last panel, and I think it's going to be a really interesting one. We're going to explore how growing global and domestic inequality is fueling the growth of populism. We're going to hear from our panel about how global inequality, which is now at record levels, leading to the fracturing of the social contract in many Western democracies, has enabled the emergence of political leaders and parties who have challenged the very essence of our democratic values. We have seen that progressives in many countries are challenged by reactionary forces who have built up substantial power and support by targeting and blaming others for the misfortunes of their communities. Left-wing parties in many places are struggling to respond to this and in a way that connects with the traditional voter allegiance. Our panel today is Eric Lonergan, Catherine Murphy, and Jon Cruddas. I want to thank the three of you very much for joining us. I'm really looking forward to the chats we're going to have. Just to remind everyone, we'll be doing a couple of Mentimeter questions. You all know the formula by now, and we'll try to get as many of your questions as we can after our three speakers. So please do use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, we open the session with Eric. Eric is a macro hedge fund manager. Macro hedge funds are managed to profit from broad swings caused by political or economic events. I hope that's correct. To a lot of people here, hedge funds, because their association with vulture funds and the housing crisis might seem like a dirty word. But Eric is going to talk to us specifically about how markets can be used for good in the form of sovereign wealth funds. Eric is a big supporter of the Big Issue Invest, which is the investment arm of the Big Issue. Who have been involved in some really worthwhile social enterprises, such as providing microfinance to individuals as an alternative to unscrupulous moneylenders. Eric is also an economist and author. He has co-written Angrynomics with Mark Blight, in which they look at how anger has become an outlet for political action to the changing economic fortunes of individuals and communities. In his book, Eric has identified the drivers of this anger and has some interesting things to tell us about how he believes political parties should react to it. When he's not advising world affairs, he gives his time to projects such as Big Issue, as I've mentioned, and to the Empathy Museum, which is an extraordinary group who have brought us projects such as the Human Library. And if you haven't heard of them, I suggest you check them out. So over to you, Eric.
Thank you very much, Jan. And first of all, thank you to Catherine and thank you to everybody for inviting me to be involved in this panel. I'm really looking forward to it. If it isn't the most important issue, it's got to be one of the three most important issues facing the world at the moment, which is how do we tackle inequality. I'm going to try and focus my comments on a relatively narrow aspect, but one that I think is a very empowering dimension to this problem, which is very rarely spoken about, because I think one of the first problems one has when you think about wealth and income inequality, and really these are problems that date back over 30 years, is how really our societies have singularly failed to address them in any coherent way. So if I look across the political spectrum in Europe or in the United States, I can't really see anybody coming up with very coherent plans as to how to address wealth inequality. So I think one of the things is an awful lot of the work has been done on the diagnosis, but I think when it comes to concrete ideas about how to do something about it, it's less convincing, and it's certainly not necessarily ideas that one thinks could be very politically viable or even relatively easy to execute. And I want to challenge that belief, because I actually think there's a very strange feature of the world is in many ways the current generations are amongst the most fortunate. And the reason for that is that the state's cost of our state, the Irish state, and this is true of all European states, have the lowest cost of capital pretty much in economic history. Now, what do I mean by that? It's a really simple point, and it's neglected far too frequently. So I was just checking on the computer what the Irish government can borrow. It's fixed at a fixed rate of interest. This is as of Friday's close in financial markets. The Irish government can borrow at a fixed rate of interest for less than 0.5% for 20 years. That's a fixed rate of interest for 20 years at close to zero. Right? Now, if you could imagine, and now you may think, well, so what? And that can be confusing to a lot of people. A lot of people barely know what a bond market is, let alone, what are the implications of that? Well, the implications of that are quite profound, because that's an extraordinarily powerful position to be in if you want to create assets, and assets are linked to wealth. And one of the major problems we have in our society is that, depending where you are, but this is broadly true across the developed world, between 60 to 80% of the population have very, very few assets. And then the top 10% have a huge concentration of assets, and the top 1% have an even greater concentration, and very often the 0.01% have even more. So in my view, the real challenge is effectively to give assets to people who don't have assets. Now, one of the ideas that which Joan alluded to, which Mark Blythe and I outlined in our book Angrynomics, is to say, well, why aren't we taking advantage of the fact that we can borrow at a fixed rate of interest of 0.5 fixed for 20 years? And do something that a number of countries have done. For example, Norway, which has a sovereign wealth fund. Now, you're going to have to bear with me, and I'm going to try and explain this as clearly as possible. Now, Norway has a sovereign wealth fund because they received a lot of oil revenues, and instead of spending the oil revenues, they thought, well, why don't we invest these in the stock market, the global bond market, in all of these different investment vehicles globally. So on a quite a diversified fashion. So they didn't just buy shares in other oil companies. They invested effectively as private capital would, but on behalf of the population with the revenues that they were creating from oil. And the key point here is the returns that they get. So what's really interesting is if you look at the sovereign wealth fund in Norway today, which is one of the biggest funds in the world, and it goes into hundreds of billions of euros. More than 50% of it is now due to the returns that they generated, right? So over 20 years, they actually generated returns of, I think, about 6 to 7%. Right? So you can generate. So what you can do is if you go to the private sector and say, can you create a diversified portfolio of assets? So invest in the private sector. And there are various means of doing that. You can invest through the stock market, or you can invest through direct investments like private equity, or you can invest in credit. You can make loans, but you create a diversified portfolio of assets. You can create it. You can be reasonably confident that you can generate a return of, on average, 4 to 6% over the medium term. Now, you want to take a 10 or 15 or 20-year view, because as we all know, there could be an 18-month period where the stock market crashes, or there's some big recession where you'll have negative returns. But if you extend your time horizon, there's a very high probability that you can generate a return at least in excess of 3 or 4%, and possibly as high as 6 or 7% on average over the medium term. And we've got lots of examples. The Norwegians have done this, the Singaporeans have done this, the Chinese are doing this through a Chinese sovereign wealth fund. Now, my suggestion is a really quite a simple one, which is, why doesn't a country like Ireland, which can issue debt fixed at 0.5% for 20 years, create a sovereign wealth fund, which is effectively substantially financed by issuing those government bonds at 0.5%. Now, you might say, well, hang on a minute, isn't that very risky, because I'm issuing debt, whereas the Norwegians were generating revenues from oil? Well, the key point is you only have to make a return in excess of 0.5% in order effectively to create assets for the state. right? So if you simply did what Norway did, but instead of using oil revenues, you issued government bonds into the government bond market, the Irish government would now be in a position where it could actually repay those loans, and it would still have a vast amount of assets. So it would be half the size of the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund, but because of the power of compound interest. So if your cost of debt is fixed at a very low rate and you're creating returns, admittedly volatile but through time, you actually create value. And there's a critical distinction here, which is the difference between borrowing money to spend it on, consumption, a bit like living off your credit card, as opposed to borrowing for an investment, such as, taking out a mortgage. So for example, let's say you took out a mortgage and you wanted to make an investment and you're going to rent out the property. And people in Ireland are more than familiar with this. Well, imagine you could borrow at a fixed rate of interest of 0.5%. That means if you could get a rental income of 3 or 4 or 5%, you are actually creating value because you can repay the loan and the equity in the property builds. And really all I'm suggesting is that we do that at a national level on behalf of the state. And people say, oh, but haven't we got too much debt, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the first thing I would say, always, whenever anybody says that to you, will say, what's the rate of interest on the debt? So if a country has too much debt, it has a high rate of interest because that's telling you that there's a credit risk. But hang on a minute, if we can borrow at 0.5%, how can we have too much debt? That doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense. And the other thing is people will say, well, what if interest rates go up? But these are fixed rate, right? The Irish government can issue for 20 years at a fixed rate of interest rate. That's quite extraordinary. So if interest rates go up, doesn't affect it. And in fact, in a way, if you think interest rates are going to go up, you should definitely do this, right? Because you've got an enormous window of opportunity to borrow at so low rates of interest. Now, people will understandably say, we shouldn't just borrow and spend the money. It makes a huge difference if you borrow money and invest in assets, invest in investment occurring, real assets being built in the economy, which is broadly what I'm suggesting. Now, I've only got a few more minutes and I want to wrap up. So essentially my idea is that, or the idea that I've developed with Mark Blythe and many others have written about this, is that the state should be taking advantage of its balance sheet currently to acquire assets. Now you can either acquire those assets in financial markets, and I'll come back to there's other ways of creating assets as well. And what it should really do is, I would from day one, bear in mind, this is something you could do within 3 to 6 months. And there is no reason why, in a sense, there should be any political opposition from left or right, because at the moment we're just squandering an opportunity. So this is an entirely reasonable thing to do. But I would give ownership. So one thing the Norwegians haven't done is, why haven't they given ownership to individuals in the society? Nobody's really raised that issue. But I would give ownership to the 80% of the population who don't have assets or who have very small quantities of assets. I'd give them ownership immediately. Now, I would say to them, unfortunately, it's not dropping manna from heaven. You can't just immediately rush out and spend it. This would have, it would be like, just like, rich people get inheritance trusts. Why can't the population have a trust as well? So you would receive a share in this trust. And over time, as it generates returns and it repays the debt, that would become more and more valuable. So it would be something that means you have a stake in the future and you have a stake in the system. And that on a 10 or 15 or 20-year view, it could be drawn down for specific purposes. So maybe people would use it either for housing, or they might use it for healthcare, or they might use it for education and skills, or they might use it to create a business. What one could think, there's an interesting political debate to be had about what uses, because obviously we don't want this to become a substitute for what the other forms of provision that the state should be providing. The key point here, it may be people just want to keep it as a savings vehicle and something they can pass on to their children. But either way, there needs to be, this is a very simple way of creating ownership in assets for a significant part of the population that currently has very low level of assets. The second idea I think that one could also do, and you could even use the sovereign wealth fund to do, and this relates to tackling the problem of climate change. And I think this is a very, very neglectful dimension of the debate, is if you analyze the challenge of global emissions, the critical component is how we generate electricity, because almost everything else that we do becomes more sustainable if electricity generation is more sustainable. Right? Now, what do I mean by that? Is, well, if you take, there's no point in me buying an electric vehicle if the electricity being generated is coming from coal-fired power stations. That makes no sense, because all I'm doing is, okay, I'm not using petrol, but effectively I'm using coal indirectly. But if wind and solar and other sustainable forms of electricity generation are being used, then actually everything else that we do, as long as we substitute using electricity, becomes much more sustainable. Now, the interesting thing is electricity generation is all about capital investment, right? They are regulated utilities. And the returns, if I build a wind farm, the returns to building a wind farm are very, very predictable. And at the moment, we have a crazy situation where across most of the developed world, the private sector is requiring returns of 6 or 7% to make these investments, when the state can borrow at 0.5%. Now, that is absolutely crazy, because why do we need investment in our electricity to generate 6 or 7% when we, the public, can borrow at 0.5? If it makes a 2% or a 3% return, it's completely viable. In fact, it's creating wealth for us. Now, if we collapse the cost to building infrastructure, which is sustainable electricity generation, we will have a huge explosion in investment spending. Okay? So you will get a huge increase in investment spending. And there's absolutely no reason why the state shouldn't be doing that. Now, frankly, I don't mind whether the state doesn't have to build the infrastructure. The state can own it and borrow for it, or the state can take an equity stake and provide finance on a return, expecting to get a return. Right? We can make money out of this, right? And I don't mean that we're not trying to become rich. I just mean the state's balance sheet would be stronger because we would own more assets as a public, whilst accelerating the green transition. Right? Now, all of this is made possible by the fact that we can borrow at 0.5. Fixed for very long periods of time. So the irony here is we are incredibly lucky. If we have to borrow at 15%, it would be a big problem, right? We would actually have to raise lots and lots of taxes, and we would all have to consume less in order to invest. But we have the opposite problem, which is our cost of borrowing is incredibly low at fixed rates of interest, which means we can do virtually any investment and it would create an excess return, which creates value to us as the public.
Thank you so much, Eric. That was absolutely fascinating. We could talk about this all day, and I'm not sure I'm allowed to ask you questions, but just as we're setting up the Mentimeter question, which is going to be what feeling most accurately describes your motivation to be politically active, just while that's been set up, I am going to just ask you quickly, or just make a comment about what you've just said there. I mean, it's so blindingly obvious. It's a total no-brainer. And if the politicians who were running the country were running it on behalf of the people, then that would be the obvious conclusion they would come to. Or is there some other reason why, you know, we're not just doing that? Why is Pascal Donoghue, our Minister for Finance, why isn't he, you know, championing this right now on behalf of the Irish people?
It's a great question, and it's, I mean, it is one that obviously I've thought about a fair bit. I think it may be blindingly obvious, but I don't think it's talked about nearly enough in the public debate. So if I've just been reading lots of books on climate change, and virtually none of them mention this point about how low the cost of capital is currently. I mean, if you read Bill Gates has just got a book out on how do we deal with climate change, nowhere does he mention how cheap it is for the government to borrow money, which should be one of the first points that he makes. Because in any consideration of an investment, if you think about it, you look at what you think the return is going to be, so how much cash flow is the investment going to generate, but you have to look at your cost of capital. How much does it cost me to borrow? And that determines whether a project is viable or not. And so the most important variable in considering our policy is the cost of our debt. And yet, you know, I suspect if I listen to the news and RTE, or I listen to a program about the environment on RTE this evening, no one is going to say, you do realize that we can borrow at less than 0.5% fixed. So why don't we just do all of this super fast?
Yeah. Yeah, I think they hide behind the fact that they think people necessarily don't understand money, or they think it's confusing, or they think it's more complicated than it actually is. So, but anyway, I'm going to stop asking questions. So these are the, you just need to use the code 19908299. And then the question again is, what feelings most accurately describe your motivation to be politically active? So I think there's going to be answers coming in on that, or are they the answers? Is the large one frustration, empathy, hope, solidarity? Oh yeah, see how this is working now. Sorry, it's my first time doing this. Yeah, so the first one is frustration. Does anyone else want to comment on some of the answers that are coming in? Catherine, are you there?
Yeah, my motivation right from the word go was anger. It gets me off me seat. It makes me do things, and so long as you contain that anger and you use it constructively, I think it's a great motivation. And they notice that about me in the office, and come back and say, "Oh yeah, we see we're angry again." So that's my motivation, and it's not a negative motivation. It's just whatever gets you going is the important thing. But those other things wrap up in it, like your anger can lead you towards a politics of solidarity. It can be a motivation of hope as well. So don't see it as negative.
Yeah, absolutely. John?
I was just thinking as Catherine was talking how similar my answer would be if I was asked that question. It's a sort of, I started off in the trade union movement very young as a construction worker, and it was a mixture of anger and frustration about how things are compared to how they should be. And I agree, it is a sort of it is a positive engine, anger, if channeled effectively. It can spin off into all sorts of less benign forms, but I find it a very positive attribute to sort of drive the search for political change. Still do. Yeah,
I couldn't agree more, and I think that's the basis of the book that you wrote. You know, it's a good anger. It's about justice, about injustice, and about, you know, making us all get up off our backsides and try and do the right thing every day. So, thank you so much for that. I'm just going to, John, you're speaking now, so we'll just go ahead with you. I just wanted to say, first of all, you know, thanks again for coming. John is the MP for Dagenham and Rainham in the UK Parliament. John is joining us from County Mayo, and obviously you're very welcome. Now, John, I know you had a tough week. We were trying to get to talk to each other this week, but yourself and your constituents were having a tough week, impacted directly, of course, by the horrendous situation in Afghanistan. So that's an extreme example of inequality that's happening in the world right now. So you were elected in 2001, representing a strong traditional working class constituency that was once home to the biggest car manufacturing plant in Europe. John has seen his local economy transform from a powerhouse of manufacturing in the 1970s to one where deprivation and inequality have replaced growth and prosperity. John has confronted the anger that Eric referred to on the streets of his constituency, where he successfully defended his seat against the far right. Jon was policy coordinator in Ed Miliband's shadow cabinet in 2012 and expressed a preference for policy development with the UK Labour Party. In addition to his political work, Jon is a visiting fellow at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and Nuffield College in Oxford. He is the author of The Dignity of Labour. I've heard you talk about inclusive societies, investing in families, the value of home life and working life. And we're really looking forward to hearing what you have to say about this. Thanks, Jon.
Well, thanks, Joan. It's very good to be here this afternoon. And many thanks for the invitation. I was asked to talk about the book I recently wrote. It's called The Dignity of Labour, but looking at your agenda, it covers a number of themes that have been central to your proceedings. So I thought I'd just give you a bit of background about where it was coming from a specific UK perspective, which cover more wider generic themes about the strength of our democracies, the lack of inclusive growth that Eric was talking about, collapse of social democracy. And I must admit, I'm very attracted to Eric's ideas about the asset transfer issues, but I'm coming from the question of inclusive growth from a slightly different perspective. To briefly explain, the origins of the book lie in, I suppose, three crises that we can sort of identify that threaten liberal democracy and actually predate the pandemic. Firstly, the crisis of the left, the crisis of social democracy, if you want, its lack of moral purpose. The second crisis is the rise of authoritarian populism that sort of is rampaging across the planet, upending our politics, threatening our democracies. And the third one is, since the economic crash, especially in the UK perspective, is our decade-long productivity puzzle and longer-term post-war structural UK productivity problems. And I sort of try and link those three by returning to a very unfashionable territory for social democracy and the left, and politics more generally, which is how Labour is understood, how it's rewarded, and how it's represented. And sort of linked to the pandemic, actually, because this has sort of shone a light on the dignity of the work and the vocations performed by many of our fellow citizens, who are often, in the UK sense, often labelled part of the so-called left behind, which I think is a wretched phrase. So the idea is a return to a new politics of labour, of work, could provide new ethical foundations in terms of the renewal of social democracy, make liberal democracies more resilient, and offer a route through some of these productivity problems. So the book's divided into two parts. Part one considers three competing economic philosophies regarding human labour that define post-war British politics. The first defined from classical political economy of Smith, Mill, Ricardo, which influenced post-war stakeholding or post-war corporatism. The second from the neoclassical revolution of the 1870s that defined the politics of Thatcher. And finally, in the UK context, fashionable Marxism present on the Jeremy Corbyn left and its relationship to classical Marxism. And I basically try and argue the case for a sort of lost social democratic post-war tradition, a form of early economic stakeholding that sought to bolt the working class into the operation of the economy through the promotion of good quality of work, extending free collective bargaining, and seek to sort of update that tradition today, because you find no evidence of its actual existence, even its history. And part two of the book, rather than considering competing political philosophies regarding labour issues, looks at questions of justice in terms of three different approaches. First, about how you maximise human welfare, usually meant to mean maximising utility. The second, questions of rights and freedoms. And the third, with more classical, ancient concerns about promoting human virtue. And it's the last one concerned with virtue, the common good, that I think has been lost in terms of the evolution of social democracy or left-wing politics. So the argument is to rehabilitate the ethical character of social democracy. We need to return to some of these lost histories, past not travel, and wrap it in a question of returning to questions of human labour. So if we look at today, as Eric was mentioning, capitalism looks increasingly unstable. It's ill-equipped to deliver on its promises, yet it's social democracy or the left that sits or stands in crisis. I'm actually often reminded of an old Peanuts cartoon that captures this sort of thing, this sort of paralysis on the left, where this Charlie Brown returns from a baseball game, totally despondent. And there's 4 slides of him looking totally dejected. In the first slide, he simply says, "A good grief." He's got his baseball mitt in his hand and his bat over his shoulder. And the second one, he says, "We lost 184-0. The third, he says, "I just don't understand this." And in the fourth, he says, "How can we lose when we're so sincere?" And how can we lose when we're so sincere? I think this sort of phrase captures a lot of what I see across my party, across social democracy in the UK, where we're almost unable to diagnose our own position because of a sort of form of righteousness. There's a great use of this Charlie Brown thing in George Packer's biography of the diplomat Richard Holbrooke to reflect the US experience of Vietnam. But I think it approximates to the problems of social democracy. We keep losing. We can't understand why, because we're so well-meaning. Consequently, there's little debate around what we're for, what is social democracy about, its future character. In the UK, we've lost 4 elections in 11 years. We face a mounting decline to win another, but there's little real diagnosis of it. So I basically just try and pose an argument that Labour should rebuild around questions of human dignity, and we should, as we emerge out of the pandemic, and I specifically use in this book the question of the dignity of Labour. Now, you might obviously say that's what Labour is all about, and I would say historically, yes, but recently we've become over-reliant on assumptions that the working class are on the wrong side of history. They're withering away due to technological change, that the robots are coming. But I sort of push back against this and say there's little evidence of this. And the danger, we continue to write the working class out of the script. People know it, they feel it, and funnily enough, they're less prepared to vote for us because of it. And they're instead being attracted by more authoritarian populists on the right. Thomas Piketty has recently talked about the rise of what he calls the Brahmin Left, the most educated citizens and the greatest beneficiaries of the knowledge economy and our meritocracies have captured left-wing parties at the expense and social democracy and at the expense of the working classes. Brahmin literally means socially or culturally superior. Labour, in the UK sense, Labour is drawn from certain parts of society and geographically certain urban university towns, basically. 74% of our membership is drawn from the professional middle classes. We're pulling an increasing vote share from social classes ABC1. There's been a recent YouGov poll that said the Conservative Party lead by 25%, 52 to 27, over Labour amongst working class voters. And here's the sort of kicker, and why I jumped into this sort of debate, is without any debate, a dramatic reset is currently underway on the left within social democracy and wider socialist movements, underreported but highly significant. There's a sort of new left-wing imagination of automated communism, of post-capitalism, where we demand full automation, a world without work, of abundance, often financed by universal income, where there is no such thing as dignified purposeful work. And what is emerging is a very powerful lobby in the UK, I don't know about Ireland, which self-identify as a post-work left. And I think that has to be contested, really. Historically, you could say technological determinism has been a feature of social democracy of the left from its inception, from Corbyn to Blair, actually, and lies deep within our history. And in the book, I go through a lot of the data and just contest these arguments and suggest that human labour remains central to the notion of a good life, of the common good. There's a massive evidence of the role and purpose of work in our lives as a source of dignity above and beyond material reward. The evidence that suggests the robots are coming is highly questionable. Basically, technology is not destiny. These are political questions. And such assumptions allow politicians to get off the hook. There's very little academic evidence about, or consensus about future technological disruption. Much of it is speculative, contains serious methodological flaws. We should instead focus on political choices that confront us going forward. And that's been sort of starkly revealed by a tiny virus. Now, many in the UK Labour, I should warn you, hate this argument. A lot of the Blair crowd hate it, a lot of the Corbyn crowd hate it and reject it out of hand. They remain captive to forms of technological or demographic determinism that sees victory in almost every defeat. You know, that we've got youth on our side, technology on our side. There's a new urban networked youth that will be the new vanguard of social democracy. Now, I accept my argument is unpopular. It's politics. I'm sort of not in it to make friends, really. But for me, the clock's ticking. We've lost, as I say, 4 and 11, and there's no safe political space anymore. In the UK, the Tories, what's called their levelling up agenda, with victories in the so-called Red Wall, with post-Brexit working class support, is a very serious threat to the very future of Labour. So we have to confront it rather than hand over these traditional communities and bed down in our urban environments, our university towns, because that would be deadly, because there's no coalition that can win in those parts of the landscape. Moreover, to put it bluntly, that was not what social democracy was created for. It was built around a model of justice rather than just chasing cohorts of voters. So look, the book contains loads of policies. I won't go into it, about this idea of a good work covenant, new national colleges for skilled work to turn jobs such as social care into respected, well-rewarded vocations as they should be. In the UK, those jobs that involve the most care for one another are the least paid jobs in the country. And that is quite a revealing reflection of who we are as a country. I argue for a new statutory definition of worker decoupled from contractual status to align all rights for all employees and offer protections for all. A new pandemic reconstruction force for jobs and growth, a new right to work. As I mentioned, the book is the first of 3. The second is on how we build strong communities as part of a renewed social contract. And the third is on how we rethink human rights in an era of surveillance capitalism and technological power. So overall, my basic argument, I suppose, is we need to get out from under the trap game of modern social democratic and left politics, that you choose sides between some binary debates, leave or remain around Brexit, age, young versus old, urban versus suburban or rural, working versus middle class, of educated, uneducated. And one way to do this and rehabilitate a sort of transcendent politics of the common good, I argue, is by returning to questions of how we understand human labour as an economic and social category. So by way of introduction, that's where I'm coming from, Joan. Thanks.
Wow. Oh my God. There's so much I want to ask, and we're a little bit tight in time. So if there is time at the end, I will ask, but I definitely, I'll go straight to peanuts, because it's one of my favorites, and there is just so many valuable lessons. And I think, you know, the one thing I've learned from knocking on doors is that people don't care about politics, but they care about how it impacts them. And when they meet you face to face, we're all the same. We all have the same, you know, desires and needs and wants, and, you know, community and family and work is so important. I mean, I wrote my dissertation on the motivation to work, and it was all the responses were about, you know, about dignity and purpose and all of that. And, you know, it's so hugely valuable. So sorry, I'm going to stop talking. I want to thank you so much, Jon. That was brilliant. We have a load of questions coming in. We'll get to them at the end. So our final speaker, Catherine Murphy, TD, needs little introduction. Catherine is the co-leader of the Social Democrats. Catherine is a spokesperson on justice, enterprise, trade and employment and transport. And if you thought that brief was not broad enough, she's also a member of the Public Accounts Committee. It was Catherine's work on CllR and the FAI that really motivated me to get involved in politics. And just want to say, Catherine, I think you're a huge power for good in this country. So Catherine, we've heard from Eric and Jon about the effects of inequality on people's lives and the institutions of democracy from a global and UK perspective. So we want to talk to you about how things are looking from an Irish perspective. We will be asking another Mentimeter question about what we consider the main threats to democracy in Ireland is after you've had your turn. So if you want to go ahead, Catherine. Thanks
very much. Thank you. That was both of the previous speakers hugely interesting. I've got 2 books on my book list now. I'm going to maybe start from the economic crash, just looking the last 10 years. And I think you need to do that to kind of have an idea of what might be the opportunities for the next 10 years and why people should get involved in politics and shape their future. We know that inequality is growing with just to 60% of the wealth owned by about 10% of the population. As we know, it's getting worse. It gets worse as you start going down to kind of the 1% of the population. And there's no doubt that the economic crash recast politics both here and elsewhere as well. I think people wanted to disrupt. They wanted, they were looking for change that would kick out the, if you like, the establishment, if you like, but change for its own, change for the sake of change is never going to deliver. It has to be a thoughtful change. So we've had, as I say, not just here but elsewhere, we've had 4 very turbulent years in the US with Trump and the lies on the alternative facts. We've seen the Boris Johnson's Tories with, the lies around Brexit, and we followed that so closely. And indeed, then we saw, what scant regard there was, for example, to the Northern Ireland peace process in the context of that debate. So it does impact beyond the UK. In advance of the economic crash here, we had loads of predictions that we had a big property bubble, that we were going to run into trouble with. There was European monetary policy had meant that there was a lot of cheap money. And when the crash came, then that crash was huge. Pre the departure of the UK, and at that time, we made up about 0.9% of the EU population and about 1.2% of European GDP. But when it came to the banking collapse, we carried 42% of the entire European banking crash. And that has, meant we have a gigantic national debt. The IMF and the EU institutions arrived and we were bailed out. But most people, or many of us, felt that, in fact, what was bailed out was the French and German banks, the like of European pension funds that were bailed out, and essentially that it was only a question of who would pick up the tab. Zombie banks here, like Anglo-Irish and the Irish Nationwide Building Society, which were turned into the Irish Bank Resolution Corporation, were bailed out to the tune of 35 billion euros, with bondholders, both junior and senior bondholders, paid in full. And people just felt that was incredible and incredibly unfair. And then the assets were sold at huge discounts. And some of them had to be sold at huge discounts because, they had to be offloaded. But the pillar banks were relieved of their distressed loans, and they were transferred to the National Asset Management Agency, NAMA, which was created to sell off those loans. And one vulture fund manager, excuse me for calling them that, but he was an advisor in relation to distressed loans, said that Ireland was the gift that kept on giving, which certainly didn't make us feel very good about what we saw as essentially a fire sale that was happening, and at a time where property was starting to stabilize and increase. There was an acceleration of sales, which didn't make any sense to many of us. Our pension reserve fund was practically emptied at a time when we've an aging population and there's a future generation that will have, will carry the can on that. Our national debt per capita is somewhere around not far short of 50,000 for every man, woman and child. It's one of the biggest in the world, and it restricts our ability, and it leaves us very exposed to an economic downturn. It leaves us with a limited capacity to deal with the big issues like the climate crisis, and indeed investment in infrastructure and services. And that fiscal rules, then some of us said, would be a major straitjacket. And what's just happened recently in the context of COVID is some of the fiscal rules have been relaxed, and that is why Eric, your sovereign wealth fund is maybe just the right idea at the right time, because we're not so constrained, but we are still being supervised. In advance of the 2011 election, that was the first election after the crash. We had things like a universal social charge introduced, which raised about €4 billion annually, and that was really about a charge to pay for the huge debt, the servicing costs of the debt, which I absolutely have been reduced over the years because monetary policy in the EU has changed a bit. But the 2011 election ended up being a revenge election, with Fianna Fáil severely punished. They went from 71 to 20 seats. Less than 10 years later, they're back in a coalition government, and they're ironically, and if ironic is the word, they're back in charge of the housing portfolio after this huge banking crash. It's just so hard to figure out what people are thinking about. They've been made some recent very incredible decisions, like we're seeing social housing being turned into a financial product. We're seeing long leasing of housing, social housing, at almost market rents, with the asset being handed back essentially at the end, with no asset at the end of that huge big outlay, permitting vulture funds or indeed pension funds that would have had the benefit of the bailout, if you like, purchasing new housing estates at the expense of people who want to be owner occupiers, or maybe where there would be a better pattern of renting. And then we've seen the introduction of a shared equity loan scheme, which elevated the prices of housing when it was introduced in the UK, and we're introducing that here without learning lessons from elsewhere. So it's not an accident that housing has become unaffordable, and it's not an accident that it's just been turned into another commodity. Policy has been influenced, and policy has been written directly by the property sector, by the investment fund in some cases. And all of this is making people feel very powerless, very frustrated. And I think that is that powerlessness is something that we really have to do something about. In 2011, Fine Gael won 76 seats of the 158. Labour had a spectacular day with 37. And what they promised was a more equitable sharing of that banking collapse. We were told it would be Labour's way rather than Frankfurt's way, which ended up being a tagline and nothing more. And Fine Gael, told us that they had all these great relationships with the European People's Party, and that would help in burden sharing. Of course, it didn't. Labour said that there would be all sorts of cuts and new charges introduced if Fine Gael governed alone, and essentially they particularly picked out things like water charges would be introduced. So Irish people just sucked it up with little protest. I think most people found it incredible that there was so little or no protest. And indeed, the banking collapse took down many very good businesses. And we went from full employment to an unemployment rate of 15% very quickly. So what changed? What was the motivation for getting people out on the streets? And ironically, it was about water charges were introduced, and that was in 2014. And it turned out really it was the straw that broke the camel's back. People took to the streets. I went on most of the demonstrations myself, mingled with the crowds, listened to what they had to say, and it was very clear that it wasn't, most of it wasn't water charges at all. look, obviously with the universal social charge introduced, household property taxes, with high levels of unemployment, with a lot of mortgage distress, when people really had enough. Against that, it was obvious that ordinary households were going to be the ones that were picking up the pieces. And there were some others doing very nicely, thank you very much. But it was a very select few. The distressed assets, as I said, of NAMA and IBRC were in some cases being sold in what was seen as fire sale. And we were seeing some of the property developers that were so high profile in the middle of the crash making a return. And then people started to pay a great deal of attention to politics. I've never seen people pay more attention to detail than, you know, kind of about 5 years after the crash. Like, how is this happening? And one of the things in relation to water charges was people were constantly asking how a billionaire who had a bit of a checkered history had now got, his name is Dennis O'Brien, and he was more in the telecoms area. And how did he get, or how does the company he owned get the water metering, or some of the water metering contracts, gain from this, if you like? If you go back to that, and I think it's really quite important, he had made his fortune from the awarding of a second mobile phone license by the state. He had paid, through either himself or some of his companies had paid a Fine Gael minister, the Fine Gael minister that was going to make the decision on the awarding of this mobile phone license through a loan support scheme. He had made payments to this particular minister, and there was a subsequent commission or a tribunal of inquiry that found that those payments were directly linked to the awarding of the second mobile phone license. ESAT Digifone, ESAT Telecom was eventually sold to British Telecom. Dennis O'Brien had made about $250 million on that in the 1990s. He avoided paying capital gains tax because he became a tax exile, and he did that in a very public way. He formally made large political donations to Fine Gael, either himself or through his companies. And these were all things that were publicly known, and people couldn't understand how he ended up with some of the metering contracts. You know, it was a detail, but it was the detail that was really the string that people pulled, and it gnawed at them. And one of those distressed assets was sold by IBRC. It was purchased by Millington, which is a company owned by Dennis O'Brien. SiteServe is the name of the company. It was purchased for 45.5 million, and it was 110 million written off. With the assistance of several whistleblowers and the staff of my own office, we pieced together as best we could what happened in relation to that transaction. And there were many of the processes around the sale that there were big questions around. And I raised the issue repeatedly in the Dáil. I used parliamentary privilege. And I did that because I knew that this particular individual was very litigious. He then eventually took court action to the High Court about parliamentary privilege. That was appealed to the Supreme Court, and he lost. But my motivation really was that I felt that people had a right to get the maximum from the distressed assets that they had the misfortune to own. I felt I had an obligation to pursue this. I was trying to imagine in 20 or 30 years' time, people saying, why didn't somebody open their mouth about this? Why didn't somebody challenge how some of these assets were being sold for less than they should have been sold? Eventually, a commission of investigation was set up to look into the wider sale of IBRC. And it was to take 6 months to report on SiteServe as the first tranche. That was in 2015, and it's likely to report on that first tranche later this year. So that is a frustration in itself. The expectation is once a commission of investigation is set up, it limits the public discourse that can happen around that. And indeed, it limits even the political comment that can happen about the detail, because it is independent and it is inquiring into this. So I'm restricted in what I can say other than what I've just outlined. Since the crash, there is no doubt that we've seen inequality growing. We've seen golden circles, we've seen cronyism, we've seen people exploiting personal relationships, for personal gain, and people with access to power are, have the opportunity to do that. And people again feel powerless and feel very frustrated about it. Up to 2015, tribunals of inquiry, and there have been several, had cost this country somewhere in the region of 500 million euros, but there was little consequence. So we developed a proposal soon after we set up the Social Democrats, and that was that we wanted the introduction of an independent anti-corruption agency that was powerful. We had an under-resourced system that was very fragmented, and we felt that the state needed to become a trusted actor. Otherwise, democracy is only built on sand. Without building public trust, you'd have to say, why would the public want to buy in? We see that as really quite a central thing in embedding, a more healthy democracy, if you like. And we were seeing at the same time, around that time, 2014, 2015, we were seeing a constant rise in homelessness, family homelessness, seeing thousands of children homeless. We were seeing, a crisis constantly in our health service. And those two issues dominated when the general election in 2016 happened. Essentially, people wanted those resolved, and they were being, very mature about it, because we said we wouldn't erode the tax base. That was something we made very clear, because you wouldn't deal with these issues if you did that. Ironically, Fine Gael said that they would abolish the universal social charge, or they would phase it out. They dropped 26 seats in that general election. Mightn't have been only for that, but for some of the other things that had happened. And Labour were heavily punished, dropping from 37 seats to 7 seats. And we had found that the Social Democrats, although in 2015, we didn't make seat gains, we each did very well in our own. The three of us did very well in their own constituencies. But we were very much in startup mode, and our aim was to build a political movement rather than a political party. We said that this had to be about the next generation, not about the next general election, and it was a longer endeavour. One of the things that we did through Roisin Shortall, my co-leader, was to get political buy-in for a totally reformed health service. She did an amazing amount of work, and getting cross-party support for this. And there was an all-party committee set up. She was asked to chair it, and then there was a group of health policy analysts and experts brought in to work on that. Staunch Care resulted from that. Unlike the UK, we've never had an NHS moment, and we felt that the like of Niall Bevan would have been an inspiration in that he was the obviously minister that had the responsibility to actually introduce the national health system, so that was a piece of work that is ongoing. But I think COVID has identified just how necessary it is for us to actually deliver a single-tier healthcare system, and to deal with the fragmentation that we have at the moment. And there's some people that have to be vested interest that will be challenged by that, but that was the same in 1945 and in the UK as well. It wasn't done just very easily. Niall Bevan once said that the purpose of getting power is to be able to give it away. And it is. It's the floor below which you don't allow people to fall. It is the universal healthcare system. That's what giving power away looks like. It is about that for the many that will benefit from that. And there needs to be a different political mindset if we need to make that change. That's why political movements are needed. And people need to be reminded that they have collective power. They tend to forget that they have power, but they have to act collectively to really capture that power. So I just want to finish off by saying that somebody recently asked me, actually it was Ryan Kelly, who's dealing with our universities as for Freshers Weeks and things. He asked me, why should young people get involved in politics? And it's not just for young people, but certainly five things kind of quickly came to mind in this country anyway. They should be bloody angry about the national debt that they're going to pay for. They should be angry about the climate legacy. If we don't deal with it, what are they going to ask in 20 years' time? What were you doing? They should be angry about, when they go to rent or buy a house, that they discover that they're not. It's not going to be possible for them because it's been turned into an international money making racket. They should be really angry about the pension time bomb that they're going to pick up the pieces for. They should be angry about the corruption, the cronyism, the golden circles, because inequality is not happening as an accident. It is, you're being played. They're the reasons why you need to get involved. You need to take the power back, and you can't be passive about the future if you feel the future needs to be different to the present. So inequality thrives while we divide and conquer, and it thrives when people feel powerless. But it thrives also when you leave the future to others to shape for you. And that's why I think our message coming out of the conference here today is that we need to put the shoulder to the wheel. We need to build that movement, or help build that movement, and use everyone who wants to contribute to that to build that movement, so as that we actually give power back, so as that we can take power, and that power then we have the privilege of doing what Nye Bevan did and say the purpose in getting power is to give it away. From that point of view, I think things like ideas like the investment fund, the dignity of labour, all of that are part of this. And I think it can be done. Maybe it's just me, the optimist, but can't stop being an optimist.
Wow. Thank you, Catherine. Oh my gosh, that was absolutely fabulous. I feel motivated. I'm going to run out and post in the rest of my leaflets that have been sitting here today that I need to get done. Just a couple of things that really struck me before we go to the questions, and we have a load of questions. But you're saying about taking back the power, and I just think that's just so powerful a statement. You were saying about developers writing policy, and that goes back to other commentary about why don't we have a sovereign wealth fund? It's something obvious, and it would be, why don't we have a national health service? It's something obvious that we could do. But the fact that the developers or the vested interests are all, they have all the power currently, and we need to take that back from them. But just as well, you mentioned about when you were talking about Dennis O'Brien and people coming out about the water charges, and that people started to pay attention. And I think that's really, really key. And it kind of reminded me, probably because of Dennis O'Brien paying for the Irish football team. But during Italia 90, and obviously it was our first time, being in an important football league or cup, whatever. But the old grannies were, people who were never interested in soccer before, talking about the offside rule. And I think that's what we need to do with politics. We need to get people to understand this is huge, it's important, it's vital, and to understand the detail. And once they're interested in it, they'll start to pay more attention and realize, actually, yeah, I can be part of this. So thanks a million for that, Catherine. That was awe-inspiring. I have a load of questions, but just wanted to see if Eric or John wanted to get in with any comments on anything Catherine said, specific to the Irish commentary particularly. John, would you like to go first?
Well, I just took pages of notes actually on Catherine's, and I thought it was fantastic. It's a sort of condensed recent history of Irish political economy. It was brilliant. So thanks for that. And those culpables should hold their heads in shame, really, at that sort of systematic failure. I mean, it's extraordinary when you sort of revisit the last decade, or the preceding 15 years, really, as well. No, thanks for that.
Eric?
Yeah, likewise. Very inspiring. Thank you, Catherine. I guess the thing that does frustrate me a lot, and I think when I hear, and I'm familiar with the situation in Ireland or the history of it, is the population's tolerance of cronyism right before their eyes. Because we have to believe in the state, because everything that we're proposing ultimately, you have to believe that the state can work and function well and doesn't continually get hijacked. But and I don't know, what we can do to try and improve our sort of civic culture to become less tolerant, because if we see what's happening in the UK, and we've seen it with everything around policy in COVID, again, cronyism is right in front of people. And there seems to be, and it goes back to the sort of authoritarian populism that John was alluding to, is that part of the thing is the populists think they can get away with it because apparently they can. They can just award contracts to their pals that are ripping people off in a health crisis. I mean, what's more morally and ethically outrageous than that? And I don't know what the answer to it is. I am an optimist, but in that I think we can have people in public service and committed to doing the right thing in an honest and proper way. But because ultimately that is a prerequisite for us to bring about the kinds of change that we want. I don't know. I just hope here there's some kind of retrospective legal action that somehow, when the dust settles, there'll be some kind of accountability for some of the stuff that's happening. But I found both of the speakers really fascinating, and what John was saying about the dignity of labor. I can't wait to read the book. I'm going to order it straight away. It sounds absolutely brilliant. And thank you, Catherine, for that very inspiring thoughts.
Thank you.
I'm going to just read out some of the questions, and there might not be in order, but so the first one's in from Cormac. In my experience, leverage investments have a poor track record. Are you confident, and this is for Eric, are you confident that issuing debt to establish an investment fund is a safe bet?
I mean, there's no such thing as a safe bet, but I think it can be done. It's done by the private sector, and there are examples of governments doing it very effectively. If you look at, as I said, places like Singapore, but if you also look at what the Chinese have done with their sovereign wealth fund, or the Norwegians, it has to be done in a transparent way. It has to be done with good governance. But absolutely, I mean, could you, can we generate a return on investment for the state in excess of 0.5%? That's the question you've got to ask yourself. And there are lots and lots of examples historically where the state has generated much, much higher returns than that, particularly investing in private sector assets. So it is very, very doable and very viable, but it would require, and this is something we lay out in the book, it needs good governance, and it needs transparency, and it needs to be at arm's length. But think of Harvard Endowment. If you look at the universities, if you look at the Wellcome Trust in the UK, I mean, there are lots of charitable organizations and university endowments. If they can generate a 4 or 5% or 6% return, why can't the state do it?
Yeah. I think we have had some examples here in Ireland anyway of charities not necessarily doing the right thing either with money. But we have another question in here that's given the past experience, the National Treasury Management Agency, don't you think the risk of a project like this becoming co-opted by vested interests is substantial? Catherine?
I mean, I completely agree. Good governance is absolutely critical and transparency is absolutely critical. We've seen situations which I think dent people's confidence where they have seen, you know, our national broadband plan, the most recent, you know, one, you know, it was, what's going to happen is that we're not going to own it at the end of putting 3 billion in. People don't have confidence when they start seeing that kind of thing where the state is carrying the cost but not seeing it as an investment where there's a return. I'm saying it'll be the technology will be well out of date by the end of it, but we're seeing things like poor governance around even issuing contracts for, you know, the like of our national children's hospital, which is going to be the most expensive hospital in the world. It's needed. I've no doubt it'll be brilliant, but did it need to be that expensive? And the governance and the awarding of the tenders were a huge issue. So I think that dents people's confidence, and that's why we have to, you know, there has to be not only competence in governance, but there has to be the institutions, and there has to be the ability to hold people to account if things don't, if things don't, you know, are not done the way they're supposed to be done. And there is no real track record in this country of that. And I think that that is absolutely essential if you're going to take on something that, and I've got to say, I really like the idea of it, but you really have to have that confidence. Otherwise, I think it will be captured. We really kind of suffer a little bit from post-colonialism still, in that we inherited a lot of institutions. You know, we've kind of a fragmented approach to things, and we do things almost on a it's who you know kind of basis. We need to be much more rigorous about you know, the evidence-based and good governance and all of that. That's boring as hell, but absolutely essential if you're going to get the kind of buy-in and confidence in doing something or taking something on like that. I think there's loads of opportunities, particularly on climate. It's something I was on a climate committee a few years ago about looking out at the Atlantic, looking at seeing the opportunities there for wind and wave energy. We could be the exporters of it. I mean, it's not only could we make money in terms of the investment, but we could be that big exporter of that energy with the raw material that we have, which is an abundance of wind, you know, just off our shore. And essentially, you know, it can it be done? Yes, it can. But it's what you invest in, I think, as well.
Yeah. I think, Catherine, you said that we had spent, correct me if I'm wrong, 500 million on tribunals. Is that the right number? God.
That was in 2015.
Yeah, and you'd mentioned the inquiry into SiteServe and started in 2015, and we haven't got the report yet. We don't have a track record of, you know, anyone going to jail for white collar crime. I'm just wondering then, is that something that happens in the UK? John, maybe.
So you're.
I think there is a sense of, and it touches on something Eric was saying. There's a sense of fracturing of rules, oversight, scrutiny, and a sort of shamelessness that is creeping into the decision-making processes, cruelly exposed in COVID, and sort of a crony contracting culture that is developing. And there's a sense that, and this is something they quote learned from Trump, is that you can get away with it. You know, that there is no essential oversight, accountability, and you can just, you know, lie. You can cultivate this sort of forms of mateship, and in the COVID system, the actual public process of awarding contracts was suspended. Now, there are reasons why speed needed to be, engineered very quickly. But increasingly, what we're seeing through forms of public accounts scrutiny is that what was being nurtured within that was that a system of friendship, mateship, and decision-making in terms of the awarding of contracts, which was corrupt. And this will, I think, come out more and more. But I fear that, and it goes to something someone was saying earlier on, that people are so frustrated about the politics and the mishmash between the lives they wish to live compared to the ways they're forced to live, that they are recoiling from politics, and there is a sense that the well's been poisoned, and it's very difficult to reclaim a notion of the commons, and that is imperiling the very nature of liberal democracy itself globally. And you see the rise of the strong man, you see the rise of the authoritarian, the populist, you see incipient forms of fascism reappearing, you see what's happening across mainland Europe, you see what, not just North America, India. These are global phenomena, and you can see it in the UK now. So that's not a very upbeat response, I'm afraid, but I can see there's a sort of festering of goodwill and transparency and oversight, and I fear that this is almost not being contested. There's a questions of press accountability and scrutiny in all of this in terms of the democratic process. There's a sense that democracy is being purchased increasingly, and so it's not. So what Catherine was speaking to, these are generic features. I mean, there is an intense features of recent Irish history, but what's happening in the UK plays into this model that you see vividly exposed in the recent history of the Irish state.
Yeah. Okay, sorry, this is another one for Jon. You led great victories, first putting the BNP on the back foot and then defeating them in East London. Do you think that the far right has changed in the last few years, or is it simply utilising social media and conspiracy theories to target and reach people on the back of a decade of austerity focused on the middle and working classes after the financial crisis that has seen this growth? What tips would you give for combating far-right extremists on the ground for members and public reps today?
That's a big question. Thanks for that. I suppose we were one of the first red wall constituencies when we had 13 out of 51 BNP councillors. Nick Griffin stood in the constituency next door to me in 2010. They thought they could take the council. And it was basically a organizational fight back on the ground, and that made us more resilient a decade later when Boris Johnson was playing into this post-Brexit working class communities. So we managed to sort of push back against it, partly because we'd hit this wall 15 years earlier than many others. So we learnt some mistakes. We became sluggish. We didn't innovate in terms of our ground game organisationally. The basics of politics, everything is local. And now for the last 3 council elections, we won 51 out of 51 Labour. So there is a lot to be said for reviewing and continuously upgrading your essential organisational agenda. But then there's a wider policy agenda. And we've now got one of the youngest councillor bases, a very innovative local council. We're rebuilding Dagenham, actually, relocating all of the London markets, film studios, universities, all of this, partly because we sort of peered over the precipice as a party. We were dying culturally, policy-wise, organisationally, and we just sort of renewed. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned from that in terms of a wider story of Labour today, actually, because, as I say, we're not in pretty good shape, and we've got quite a bumpy period ahead of us. But there is a wider sense of the need to organisationally renew, to confront a lot of what we're seeing. I mean, what worries me, actually, more than anything in terms of locally on the ground is I do a lot of work with anti-fascist groups, and the QAnon movement, the anti-vaccination movements, some of the populist messaging around migration. This is creating quite a sort of a strange coalitions that are populist, are deeply anti-democratic, and there are forms of tyrant that will want to lead this. We saw this iteration with Trump, but we see it in England growing, and it is a real threat, actually. And I fear with the defeat of Trump, we take our eye off the ball of these developing threats and the conspiracies and the what lies beneath. And the anti-vaccination movement, the demonstrations in London have been really frightening in terms of touching a nerve and creating a very strange correlation of people, and linked into forms of social media organization, which we didn't have to confront 15 years ago with the BNP, but they are very innovative in terms of social media. So I'm very worried about how that plays out in terms of the future of our democratic architecture, actually.
Well, we're running out of time fast. We've a few more minutes. I just wanted to ask you, and Catherine had mentioned a couple of times, which was talking about, answering the questions from, 20 years from now, like who, we're at a crossroads here in terms of climate change, and, we're running down the clock. So if you were to maybe just say one thing that you would like to say in 20 years' time that you did for the future generations in terms of climate change, what would it be, Catherine? Oh, you're on mute, Catherine, sorry.
Sorry, I think we have to be ambitious enough. I mean, in 20 years' time, are we honestly going to tell people, well, if we're lucky enough to be around, some of us in that length of time, but if you were trying to explain to somebody in 20 years' time that the fiscal rules were the reason why we allowed that we didn't meet our goals, I don't think it would make a whole lot of sense. That we were constrained from doing innovative things because our debt to GDP ratio didn't conform with what the euro was designed to do. And so I think, let's put ourselves in that place and let's take the responsibility of answering that question today, because that question will be asked in the future if we're not ambitious enough.
Thanks, Catherine. Eric?
I mean, I'm an economist, so the one thing I'd want to contribute is what I'm trying to do now in this discussion is to change the nature of the debate. The climate change is absolutely tractable. It's an investment problem. We need to change the capital base of our entire economy, and we have the lowest cost of capital in human history. If we do it with good governance and effectively, it'll create huge amounts of jobs. It'll create urban and regional regeneration. And it'll make not just our air cleaner and our quality of lives better, it'll actually result in higher levels of disposable income. And if we did it really, really well, it could even result in a better distribution of income and wealth. So it's just criminal negligence not to do it. And we won't just be viewed as being amoral or immoral, we'll also be viewed as being complete and utter fools by future generations.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Jon?
I don't think I can beat that answer at all. I'll look at it from a different angle then. I'm increasingly interested in, there's a lot of talk about New Deal, Green New Deal, a New Deal, looking back to the 30s, etc. I'm more interested in where FDR went in the 40s when he started in terms of economic and social rights rather than fiscal expansion and the New Deal as usually understood, and whether you could build political campaigns about the right to be a citizen in a political community that's not being degraded environmentally, and whether you can push back by creating new forms of economic and social rights commensurate with the challenges today rather than the 40s or the post-war international human rights agenda as we emerged out of the Second World War in terms of challenging tech platforms, environmental degradation, the right to work, right to education, right to healthcare, some of the issues Catherine was talking about in terms of socialized medicine, whether you can create a reimagined human rights to today with the environment centre stage in that, and the obligations, therefore, for all politicians, anyone who aspires to office, to speak to some form of new constitutional right not to live in a degraded environment.
Okay, well, I think we're coming up to time, so if I just say that I really enjoyed it. I hope you guys have enjoyed it as well. It really was an absolutely brilliant session. Thank you so much for your time, and I think the place is in safe hands with people like you guys. So what's going to happen next is, if the audience could bear with us, we're going to have the closing address by Gary Gannon. He's our TD for Dublin Central. So I hope you will all join us for that. But thank you so much, and sorry that we didn't get to all of the questions, but we just didn't have enough time today. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Joan.
Thanks, Joan.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thanks, Joan.